Market laughed at her price, only 10 credits for a broken slave, but a human gave her true worth. Richard Vale remembered the silence of the soil more than its fire. It wasn't the roaring blaze that haunted him, the collapse of domes, the screams filtered through carbon-slick comms, the storm of ash blotting out the second sun. No, it was the moment afterward, when everything went still, when he pressed his palm into the cracked ground of Elis 3 and felt nothing. No warmth, no pulse, just the dry ache of a planet that had stopped listening. He'd spent 8 years trying to make that world bloom, then 37 minutes watching it die. Now, the desert wind clawed at him like memory. Rag Market 9 was made of rusted dreams, snapped landing struts, scavenged cargo pods stacked like broken teeth, tarps flapping like burial shrouds. The kind of place where no one asked questions unless there were credits in the answer. Richard pulled his hood lower and adjusted the strap across his chest, the weight of the seed box digging into his shoulder. His boots ground against scorched ferrocrete as he moved between stalls that stank of grease and ozone, spice and desperation. A vendor barked something in Slotty. Another hissed in fractured common. Cold serum. 5 credits a dose. Real chill, not the synth crap. He ignored them all. The heat pressed against his back, relentless even under shadecloth. A rivulet of sweat traced his spine. He took a sip from his flask, then immediately regretted it. Warm as spit and half gone. He had 3 drought-proof seed pods left, each one coated to root in soil where nothing else dared grow. They were supposed to trade for coolant cells or water purifiers, survival gear, not hope. Then the cage rolled out. A hush rippled through the concourse, low and curious. Even the hawkers paused. The girl was green-skinned, long-limbed and unnervingly still. She crouched barefoot on the grated floor of the transport cage, wrists bound with cheap synth rope. Her hair was a vivid, defiant red, tangled, matted, and bright as flame against the grime of her robes. A Kaleri, unmistakably. Royal cultivator stock, the auctioneer claimed. Soil-bonded, sap-stained. "Look at the hands!" the man shouted, slapping the bars. "Green down to the bones. This one fed worlds. Or so she says." "She looks like she couldn't feed a worm," someone jeered. "She worth less than fertilizer." Laughter surged. "Opening bid, 10 credits," the auctioneer called. 10 for the green ghost. Any takers?" More laughter. Someone shouted, "I'll give you half a crust loaf." Richard was about to turn away when her fingers moved. Not a flinch, not a tremor. Measured, intent. She traced 3 delicate arcs in the dust with the tip of her index finger, then pressed her palm flat against the cage floor. Slowly, she lifted it, tilting her hand to examine the print she'd left. It wasn't idle. It was cartographic. Richard froze. To most, it would have looked like nonsense. But he'd seen something like it before, back in the days before the Elis 3 collapse, when root mappers and sapseers spoke in patterns of soil compression and vascular alignment. She wasn't broken. She was calculating, mapping the terrain, measuring resonance. "She's not watching the people," he murmured aloud. "She's watching the dirt." A voice broke into his thought. "You looking to buy, scrapper?" The vendor was a squat, 3-eyed Trascan with skin like burnt rubber. He raised a brow crest. "Pretty thing, sure, but that green'll fade soon. Useless without her grove." Richard reached into his satchel and pulled out one of the seeds. It shimmered under the ambient neon, thin gold filaments nested in a swirl of maroon, encased in nutrient glass. "A seed?" the vendor snorted. "You need something that'll keep you alive, not wall art." "Sometimes," Richard said, "a seed survives longer than a wall." He turned back toward the cage. The girl's gaze had shifted. She was watching him now, not hopefully, not pleading, just watching. Like she'd already seen this moment in 1,000 variations. "I'll pay 10 credits, he called out. "And this." He held up the seed between thumb and forefinger. The crowd went quiet. "You paying extra?" someone muttered. "He's serious?" another scoffed. "For her?" The auctioneer looked at the seed, uncertain. "What is that?" "Resonant dry root," Richard said evenly. "Terran lattice blend, patented before the war." "Is it dangerous?" "No," he paused. "Unless you plant it wrong." A beat. The staff slammed down. "Sold." The cage hissed open. The crowd murmured but did not move. She didn't rise. Richard approached slowly, conscious of every eye tracking him. He crouched by the bars, the scent of rust and old oil thick in his throat. Her eyes met his. Up close, she smelled faintly of crushed leaves and burned wood. He could see the faint shimmer of lumina sap embedded along her wrists, like veins of opal under her skin. "I'm not here to harm you," he said quietly. She stared at him, still silent, still watching. He extended a hand, slow, open. She didn't take it. Instead, she reached past it, grabbed the cage's edge, and pulled herself up with a quiet grunt of effort. Her knees wobbled. He moved to steady her, but she recoiled, barely a breath's width, and then held still. Let her flinch first, relax later. They walked in silence past the lines of stalls. No one laughed now. No one cheered. Just eyes, sharp and waiting. Outside the market's edge, the sky widened into blazing pale orange, ringed by fractured moons. His skiff waited like a half-buried beetle in the sand. Patched dome, fading decals, the last remnant of a dream that burned. He keyed open the hatch and helped her inside, this time keeping his hands close but not touching. She swayed once, then caught herself, curling into a crouch near the coolant rack. He offered her a flask. "Water," he said. "Clean. Filtered twice." She took it with both hands, sipped, choked, then drank again, slower. A sheen of sweat clung to her temples. "You don't have to talk," Richard said, settling against the opposite wall. "Not yet." No answer. Just the soft glug of the water as she finished the last sip, then cradled the flask in her lap. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes. The subtle rise and fall of her breath said exhaustion, but her fingers still twitched, like roots testing for soil. He closed his eyes too. There were 2 seeds left in the box, and one now walking, silent, beside him. A survivor, a mystery, a risk. But then again, so was every seed worth planting. By the time the skiff rose off the blistered edge of Ragmarket 9, the wind had shifted. Richard felt it even through the sealed hull. The subtle pitch of thrusters grinding against a gust with teeth. Storm signs. Not dust, but heat-rift turbulence, the kind that cracked domes and fried cheap nav systems. He nudged the throttle just enough to break atmosphere. Too much speed would draw eyes. Too little, and they'd be a crater by dusk. The Kaleri woman hadn't moved since they left. She sat across from him in the cargo bay's side alcove, spine pressed to the thermal plating, legs drawn in. Her head rested against the wall, but her eyes stayed open, unblinking, alert. Not sleep, not rest, just stillness. That uncanny kind of stillness that said, "I've survived worse, but I'm not safe yet." Her red hair glowed in the filtered cockpit light, no longer wind-matted, but striking, almost defiant against the green of her skin. The bruises around her wrists had deepened, and the rope burn stood out starkly now that the market grime had dried. Richard adjusted the skiff's trajectory, setting the coordinates for the greenhouse outpost, a hidden dome he'd rigged into a living lab long before Ragmarket's trade guild cared about the dirt out here. It wasn't much, but it had water, shade, and air she could breathe. A sharp chirp from the dashboard broke his focus. External power scan, low frequency, not a weapon lock, but a ping. Someone had tried to tag them, maybe a random scan, maybe not. He muttered a curse under his breath and deactivated the transponder beacon. Not ideal. It made them harder to track, but also invisible to emergency beacons. He glanced at her again, still silent, but watching him now. "You ever been in one of these?" he asked, gesturing to the skiff's battered console. "Old model, prefab rig. She hums like a gut-shot engine, but she flies." Nothing, not even a blink. He sighed. "Right, not the chatty type." He reached down to unstrap his gear pack, stiff muscles groaning in protest. His shoulders ached from hauling the satchel all day, and the heat rash along his collarbone was flaring again. He pulled a canteen from a side pouch, took a swig, then offered it across the gap between them. She hesitated. Then, without a word, reached out, slowly, and accepted it. Her fingers brushed his, briefly, but in that half-second of contact, something passed between them. A flicker of tension, not hostile, charged, like static in dry air before a storm. She drank carefully this time, in slow, measured swallows. A survivor's instinct. Hydrate slowly, ration instinctively. When she handed it back, she looked at him, not past him. The difference was small, but it landed hard. "Thanks," he said softly, unsure why. No reply, but her gaze lingered. He broke the silence. "You were mapping something, back in the cage." A small movement, barely a nod. "I've seen it before," he added, adjusting the panel light to illuminate the floor near her feet. Soil mapping techniques, vascular memory encoding. Most people don't know what they're looking at, but I worked with Kaleri root binders before. Not many, but enough. She didn't respond, but her shoulders had shifted slightly. Less braced, less guarded. Why were you tracing root paths? He asked. Was that where you came from? Your home grove? No answer, but her fingers twitched, once, then again. Then she reached down and with slow precision touched her palm to the floor and drew a single spiral in the dust. Not random, not decorative. Richard crouched beside her, breath shallow. Is that a seed map? She paused. Then, to his shock, pressed her fingers into the center of the spiral, lifted them, and held them toward him. A faint, translucent smear remained, a dust glow, the last traces of luminous sap. His heart beat faster. That's active. You're still bonded to it. He reached for the scanner in his belt pouch, flicked it on, and hovered the probe near her palm. The interface buzzed, readout erratic but undeniable. Soil bonded. Her biochemistry had changed to sustain plant life. That wasn't just sacred in Kaleri culture, it was rare. Genetic tattoos, sap-drenched palms, and instinctual terrain memory. It made her a living archive, a walking key. His mind raced. If she still carried viable seed memory, she might not just survive, she might restore. Do you know what this means? He asked softly. You could reseed a whole zone, jumpstart biosynthesis in degraded sectors. Still nothing from her. But her breathing had changed, slower, deeper. She understood. He stepped back, giving her space. The greenhouse dome shimmered into view on the horizon 20 minutes later, tucked between two broken ridgelines, its reflective shell dull from sand scarring. No one came out this far. Too dry. Too dead. Richard angled the skiff down and throttled the landing jets. They touched down with a soft hiss, hydraulics groaning. He powered down systems, unlatched the side hatch, and stood. Come on, I've got better air in there. She followed, wordlessly. Outside, the heat slapped like an open hand. Dry wind tugged at their clothes as they crossed the landing pad toward the dome's side entry. Richard keyed in the code. The door hissed open, stale humidity brushing against them like breath from an old greenhouse. She hesitated in the threshold, nose twitching. Then she stepped inside. The interior was dim, humid and fragrant with overgrown root clusters, creeping moss trays, and salvaged irrigation vines. Every square inch of the space had been claimed by some kind of cultivated life. From the recycled floor panels to the patched lighting rigs, plants grew anywhere moisture could cling. The change in her posture was immediate. She inhaled once, deeply. Her shoulders loosened, her chin lifted. She walked to the nearest moss wall and touched it, fingertips trembling. For the first time, Richard saw her expression shift, not toward fear or suspicion, but recognition, a memory of green. He moved toward the control panel and activated the ventilation system, triggering a fresh water mist cycle. A soft spray filled the room. The temperature dropped by a few degrees. She turned toward him, eyes wide, not with alarm, but something close to reverence. He grinned. Yeah, she's ugly, but she lives. She stepped closer. Not close enough to touch, but near enough to share the mist, to let it soften the tension in her limbs. I've been trying to hybridize drought-resistant strains for years, he said. Mostly failures, burned roots, sterile pods, but maybe with your sap. She tilted her head. He trailed off. Sorry, I talk too much. She moved closer to a basin of glowing sprouts. Reaching in, she brushed a finger along one stem, then cupped her palm under it, offering a trace of sap. The plant responded, leaning into her like a creature recognizing its mother. Richard stared. She met his gaze. No smile, no words. But she didn't look away. They stood there, humid air clinging to their skin, surrounded by the breath of living things. I don't know your name, he said finally. She turned back to the sprout and touched the soil beside it, then drew a shape in the damp grit. 3 sharp curves and a center stem. He watched. Is that your name? No answer. But he would remember the shape. And she didn't flinch when he stepped closer this time. They didn't speak. Didn't need to. Something had already taken root. It wasn't silence that filled the greenhouse that first night, but something softer. Reluctant peace. Like a breath held too long finally let out in a space where the air didn't burn. The Kaleri woman, still unnamed, though Richard had started thinking of her as Flameleaf, not allowed, never allowed, had curled beside the basin where the hybrid sprout leaned toward her touch. Her fingers had remained resting on the soil long after she'd drawn her name there, as if grounding herself was more important than sleep. Richard didn't disturb her. Instead, he moved through the dome like someone pacing a cathedral. Everything he'd salvaged, everything he'd grown in desperation over the past year now existed under her gaze. Broken equipment that still ran because he believed it had to, failed seed beds, photosynthesis scaffolds patched with scavenged hull plating, an irrigation system built from medical tubing and storm-drained scrap. He knew exactly how fragile it all was, how close to failure this place danced. But tonight, for the first time, it didn't feel like failure. It felt like possibility. He passed a sprout cluster and adjusted the mist valve to reduce pressure. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, part heat, part nerves. He needed to sleep. He hadn't slept properly in 4 days, and now with someone else under his roof, someone who could disappear the second his eyes closed, it felt even less likely. Still, survival meant routine. So he returned to the water recycler and washed his hands and face, splashing away the salt crusted along his jawline. Then he stripped down to his undershirt, rolled out his mat in the far corner, and lay back beneath the dim glow of the biolights. His eyes refused to stay shut. He stared at the ceiling. He thought about her eyes, how they didn't flinch, how she never asked for anything. Not food, not help, not even her name. She had planted herself, and part of him, against better judgment, against the cold logic that had once earned him tenured grants and terraforming contracts, wanted to believe she'd grow here. He slept eventually, though not deeply. What woke him was sound, subtle, rhythmic, unnatural. Water shifting in a basin, something breathing, but not human. He sat up fast, heart hammering. The greenhouse was thick with moisture now. The hybrid sprout, his and hers, glowed faintly in the dark, casting bioluminescent blue across the walls. And she was still kneeling beside it, her hair damp with mist, her body taut and motionless. But her hands weren't still. She was doing it again, fingers tracing curves into the dirt beside the basin. Except this time she wasn't mapping. She was mixing. He moved quietly, carefully. Not to startle her. He didn't think she was afraid of him, but to avoid disrupting whatever she was doing. In her left hand, she held a broken shard of nutrient ceramic, dipped in crushed root and sap. With her right, she stirred the soil, humming so softly it was more vibration than sound. Richard crouched across from her. "What is that?" She didn't stop, but she lifted the shard enough for him to see what coated its surface, golden luminous sap, but darker than before, enriched, stabilized, and infused with his seed's broken capsule membrane. He leaned in, breath caught. "You're blending them." She finally looked at him, not to explain, to invite. She reached across the basin and placed the shard between them, then gestured to the other side of the bed, where the soil was still untouched. "You want me to plant with you?" She nodded once. The first deliberate motion of agreement she'd given since he bought her life for a handful of credits and one irreplaceable seed. He swallowed his instinct to ask questions, where she'd learned to do this, how she remembered this ritual without speech, why she chose now. None of that mattered. He pressed his palm to the soil. Together they buried the shard. By morning, the seedbed had split. A root burst through the basin wall like it had tasted water in the air and refused to wait. It wasn't just fast. It was hungry. Root fibers spread across the floor in a radial pattern. Perfect symmetry, like vascular dendrites branching through a body. Richard blinked into the light, half asleep, unsure what had woken him until he realized. The air smelled different, cleaner, sharper, alive. He shot up and stumbled to the basin. The hybrid tree had grown 1/2 meter overnight. Its trunk was pale jade, its leaves translucent with bioluminescent veins, half Kaleri, half Terran. Impossible. He ran the scanner across the bark. The readouts jumped, photosynthesis at 160% baseline. Water retention efficiency off scale. Root cohesion? Already infiltrating the floor mesh. He turned to her. She was sitting cross-legged near the sprout, hands resting on her knees, watching him. "You knew this would happen," he said. She nodded. "How?" She lifted a single finger and pointed to her chest. "You are the map." He dropped to the ground beside her, stunned. "This is what they burned, isn't it? The part they couldn't replicate." She didn't answer, but her eyes dimmed, just a little. Enough to suggest memory, loss. He didn't touch her, not yet, but his voice softened. They didn't just take your grove. They tried to erase you. The air hung heavy between them, not with silence but understanding, unspoken, but solid, rooted. He stood and moved to the comm shelf, booting up the encrypted relay. Signals buzzed, nothing from orbit. No trade beacons. No chatter from Ragmarket 9. He ran diagnostics, then froze when a red sigil flashed across the screen. Guild Marshal Ping, narrow band, tracked last known skiff ID, time-stamped 10 minutes ago. They found us, he whispered. She tilted her head, sensing the shift in him. We have to move, he said, already repacking his satchel. They must have realized I wasn't bluffing when I paid extra. He paused, looked at her. They're not going to forget you, or what you might grow. She stood slow and steady and approached the basin again. She bent down and snapped a single sprout from the edge, not the main hybrid, but one of the new runners. She cupped it in her hand like flame. Then, as he watched, she pressed it gently to the skin just below her collarbone, where her sap vein pulsed. The sprout rooted. He stared, breath caught between awe and disbelief. You're still bonded, he murmured. She nodded once. You can carry it with you. This time she gave him more than a nod. She smiled, faint, fragile, but real. And that single expression, after so much quiet, so much stillness, shook him deeper than any argument or declaration could have. They moved quickly after that. He loaded the last of the viable seeds into cryo containers, reinforced the portable grow case, and rerouted the skiff's nav through a mineral seam to jam any new scans. She moved with quiet efficiency, carrying more than he thought her frame could hold, never faltering. As they sealed the dome behind them, the air inside trembled, not from motion but from change. Something had bloomed there that wasn't just chlorophyll and sap. It was trust, still fragile, still new, but alive. The skiff hurtled low over the salt flats, its hull catching flickers of dawnlight between broken peaks. Richard gripped the controls tighter than necessary, every system on silent mode, every light dimmed. The greenhouse was behind them, sealed, masked, and hidden. But even with the route scrubbed and comms muted, he couldn't shake the sensation that they were being tracked. The woman, no longer just a silent captive, sat beside him in the passenger seat, her posture relaxed, but never careless. She cradled the sprout she'd bonded to just beneath her collarbone, its tiny leaves swaying faintly with the movement of the cabin air. It hadn't wilted, not even after transfer. That alone should have been impossible. And yet, here she was, defying the laws of biochemistry with the calm of someone who'd done it before. He should have been focused on the terrain ahead, on fuel levels, on what waited for them at the edge of Trade Route 9. Instead, his thoughts circled back to the night before, to that impossible hybrid blooming under her fingers, to the quiet way she had invited him into its creation, wordless, sacred, irrevocable. He didn't know her name, not yet, but he needed to understand her. Richard glanced over. She was watching the desert through the window, her face unreadable in profile. Maybe now was the time. I want to ask you something, he said, his voice quieter than usual, like a sound that didn't want to break something fragile. She didn't move, but her gaze flicked toward him. Not orders, just a question. Another flicker, barely a nod. He hesitated, then asked, "Who were you?" Before the cage. A long silence. He didn't push. Instead, he turned back to the console, watching the skiff's altitude stabilize. The fuel cell hummed underfoot. A heat bloom readout pulsed amber, but nothing urgent. For now, they were safe. Then he heard it, not words, not speech, but the faintest sound. Breath, shaped with intent. He turned. She was holding up her hand, tracing a line in the air, 3 curved marks, the same shape she'd etched in soil the night before. This, he said, gesturing to it. It's not just a name, is it? She shook her head. It's a title. Her lips parted just slightly. A breath, a scent, faint but detectable in the filtered air. A trace of pollen, subtle and earthy, laced with something sweet. He couldn't interpret the meaning, not exactly, but the emotion behind it hit like heat from a sun-shattered window. It meant grief. She lifted her hand to her throat, then to her chest, not a gesture of pain, of offering. Then she touched the sprout again, and finally she spoke. One word, almost a whisper. Vireya. He froze. Not just a name. He'd read the title in Kaliri xenobotanical texts years ago, when he was still a government-funded scientist with a future worth salvaging. Vireya. One of the old words for royal root mother, a cultivator of sacred groves. A person who didn't just plant life, they shaped it, coded ecosystems into instinct, stored centuries of gene memory in their veins. Richard's pulse kicked. "You're not just bonded," he breathed. "You're a seed archive." She didn't nod, didn't confirm, but her gaze met his and didn't waver. He leaned back, swallowing hard. "That's why they kept you alive." She looked away again, and suddenly he understood something else. "Not because you were a threat," he said, "because you were useful." A flash of something across her face. Shame? Rage? He couldn't be sure. But it passed, and she sat straighter in her seat, as if lifting something unseen from her shoulders. He didn't speak again for a long time. Neither did she. The skiff coasted down into the canyon mouth that led to a string of abandoned water treatment domes. Most were scavenged clean, but one still had a hidden access hatch where Richard had stored emergency supplies. They docked inside an old maintenance bay, and the moment the outer seal hissed closed, the tension in his chest began to uncoil. He set the skiff's systems to standby, powered down the fusion core, and opened the side hatch. Viraya followed him without question, carrying the sprout now cupped in a small nutrient sphere he'd given her mid-flight. He watched her scan the room instinctively, noting how she adjusted to the light, the space, the trace molds in the cracks of the old walls. Her eyes moved like a surveyor's, every surface evaluated. Inside the dome's main chamber, they spread out supplies, water rations, compressed protein, a small med kit, half empty. Richard knelt near the food packs and unwrapped a thermal brick, activating the heat pulse and setting out 2 dishes. He handed her one. Viraya sniffed it, then touched a fingertip to the edge before tasting. Her reaction was small, but her lashes fluttered once, and her throat worked faster than before, hunger tightly controlled. She didn't eat like someone grateful. She ate like someone who couldn't afford not to. He waited until she finished. Then he spoke. "You should know who I was." She blinked at him. He met her eyes, even though something in his gut warned him it would hurt to say aloud. "I was a government-funded xenobotanist," he said. "Terraforming specialist, lead architect of the LS-3 lattice." Her eyes narrowed. He continued. "I created a root spread intended to accelerate atmospheric repair, high-density soil recursion. It worked in Sim. It even worked on the first 2 moons they gave us." He paused. The next part didn't come easy. "But when we deployed the 3rd batch, something was wrong with the lattice code. Sabotaged. I didn't catch it in time." Her gaze didn't shift. He went on. 437 dead. Colonists. Surveyors. Kids." Now her eyes moved. "They said it was me, called me Green Death on the feeds, revoked my license, stripped me of every contract. I couldn't get hired to water a potted plant." She tilted her head. No pity, just listening. "I've been on the fringe ever since, selling what I can, trading seeds like relics." He looked down at the heat brick, the edges flickering faint red. "And then I saw you in that cage." Viraya placed her empty bowl down, then reached slowly across the space between them. She didn't touch him. Instead, she lifted her fingers and traced a shape in the air again, this time wider, gentler. A root curve, yes, but not a mapping arc, a sign of recognition, of forgiveness. He blinked hard, suddenly unsure if the heat in his chest was from shame or something else entirely. "I couldn't save them," he whispered. She looked at him then, truly looked, and without a word, she shifted closer, just enough that her shoulder brushed his. She didn't flinch, and for the first time in years, neither did he. They sat like that until the thermal brick cooled. No declarations, no apologies, just shared air and the slow breathing of 2 people no longer entirely alone. Outside, the dust storm began to build. The radio crackled with faint static, trade guild frequencies, jagged, dissonant. But for the moment, the dome held. For the moment, the ghosts outside the glass were silent, and inside something rooted deeper, not just survival, not just purpose, but trust, quiet, real, growing. The storm hit just after dawn. Richard had checked the sky twice before they bedded down in the dome's main chamber. The horizon had been hazy, but stable. Now it was a full-blown atmospheric fracture, winds shrieking across the canyon, tearing through old cables, shaking the structure like a beast testing the edges of its cage. The dome held, but only just. He paced near the inner hatch, already dressed, already sweating. The heat was rising fast despite the insulation, and the backup generator was coughing through cycles choked by dust. He'd meant to clean the filters yesterday. He hadn't. Too much had happened. Too fast. Virea stood at the far end of the chamber, palms pressed to the old viewport, watching the storm rage outside. Her red hair caught the rising light like flame behind glass, her silhouette outlined in dust gold. She didn't flinch at the thunder. She didn't blink at the static flashes breaking across the peaks. Richard watched her, wanted to ask what she was thinking, what memory was blooming in her expression. But before he could speak, a low chime pulsed on the comm board behind him, a signal, encrypted, close. His blood chilled. He rushed to the console, fingers flying across the interface. The signal wasn't from the Guild's standard frequency. It was buried deeper, civilian encoded, but tagged with a tracer signature he hadn't seen in years. Outrider scavengers. Not as bad as Guild enforcers, but worse in some ways. They didn't ask for clearance. They didn't issue warnings. If they detected biomass worth selling, they took it, and the vessel it rode in on. "Damn it," he muttered, pulling up the skiff's diagnostic log. "We must have left a heat echo on the ridge last night." He ran a quick system scrub, rescrambled the ID tags, shut down every non-essential beacon. The location wasn't compromised yet, but the echo trail would lead scavengers within a few clicks. Maybe less if they were flying drones. "We have to go," he said without turning around. "Now." She didn't move. "Virea." His voice sharpened. "They'll be here in less than an hour." She turned. Her face was calm, but her fingers moved in slow, intentional patterns near her ribs. Kaleri shorthand. He didn't recognize the full phrase, but the tone was clear. "We cannot abandon this." He looked past her, at the small basin near the core wall, where the hybrid sprout still pulsed faint light. She'd rerouted it during the night, enriching its soil with one of the nutrient crystals he'd long thought dead. Somehow, it had stabilized the leaf memory. The plant was already responding to microradiation, curling toward each burst of light through the dome slits like it was waking. "You're saying it's too young to move." She gave a single nod. Richard exhaled hard and scrubbed a hand down his face. "You want to fight them for a seedling?" Her silence was firm. He paced, brain moving faster now. The basin couldn't be moved, not without killing the root. They couldn't stay and fight, not with one broken rifle, a nearly dead power core, and no perimeter alarm. "Unless we don't fight them here," he said aloud. "We let them find what they're looking for, something worth taking." Virea tilted her head. He crouched beside the old medical bay and pulled out a black travel crate, long sealed shut. It took a crowbar and 3 swears to crack it open. Inside, a spare terramimic generator, compact, fragile, useless for long-term growth, but perfect for bait. "They'll scan this, think it's worth lifting. But if we rig it with a proximity shatter pulse and a flash seed, it'll overload their sensors just long enough for us to slip through the back hatch." She blinked once, clearly following. "And if we wrap it in decoy soil," he added, "they'll think they've stolen something rare. Buy us time. Maybe make them chase ghosts for a few days." Virea stepped forward and knelt beside him, pulling one of the old nutrient sachets from her pack. She sprinkled a thin layer across the mimic generator's surface, then touched her fingers to her lips and pressed them to the casing. Kaleri ritual. Farewell. Or misdirection. He wasn't sure which. They worked quickly, side by side, layering crushed moss, dead bark, and scent spores across the bait pack. When they finished, it looked, smelled, like the real thing. By the time the first drone passed overhead, they were already at the dome's north exit, sealed in environment suits, gear slung tight. The sprout she carried now lived in a portable pod slotted across her chest. He'd wrapped it in triple shielding, rigged a humidity cycle, and fixed it with a photon curtain to keep it stable. It had taken him 40 minutes to build. She had touched it once and whispered something in her language, something that made the pod emit a pulse of warmth like heartbeat. When they crested the ridge, Richard turned back one last time. The dome still stood, still silent. He could almost believe it might survive another storm cycle. But he knew better. They moved fast, legs burning, breath catching in their masks. The route took them through an old aqueduct trench, half collapsed, now home to sandrets and bitterweed. Virea adjusted her stride to match his without being asked. She didn't complain, didn't slow. Even when they stopped to rest, just a few minutes under the shadow of a broken heat collector, she said nothing. But her posture shifted, subtly, and for the first time since they'd left the cage, she leaned toward him instead of away. He passed her a hydration pack. She accepted it and drank. When she handed it back, her voice, quiet, rough, broke the silence. "You didn't leave it." He looked at her, startled. "The seed," she clarified. Richard shook his head. "Couldn't." She considered that for a moment, then said, "Most would." "I'm not most." A pause. She looked down at the pod strapped to her chest. Then back up. "You're growing," she said. Not just to him, to them. He wasn't sure what to say to that. Not until her hand brushed his elbow, just briefly, just enough to anchor the moment in his memory. A noise split the canyon behind them, sharp, mechanical. The first scavenger drop skiff descended in the far distance, a speck of metal in the brightening sky. Too late. They were already gone. And the roots were already deeper than anyone could track. The skiff drifted under the shadow of the orbital station like a seed carried on windless air. Its hull was scorched, navigation relay frayed by sand and radiation. Richard throttled power to minimum, shielding their ID with an old freight code, one of the last tricks he had left. He didn't speak. Not when the docking clamps engaged with a bone-deep clang. Not when the bay doors sealed them inside a world of artificial light and recycled air. Not even when Virea reached for her rebreather with slow, steady fingers, her green skin slick with the humidity of the suit's inner lining. This was the end of hiding. They both knew it. Station 917-A Orca's Spine was a long-abandoned mining hub retooled by trade guilds into a mobile auction house. Here, the powerful came to purchase what wasn't supposed to exist. Live flora relics, void-stable fauna, pre-burn artifacts. And sometimes, things more sacred than all of them. He'd heard rumors of Kaliri cultivators traded here, never believed them, until he saw the manifest 2 days ago. Her name wasn't on it, but the seedline signature was unmistakable. Somehow she'd been registered, cataloged, stamped with a biometric chain tied to the hybrid tree they'd grown together in the greenhouse. The very same seedling that had nearly cost them their lives. She wasn't just a person anymore. She was an intellectual asset, a specimen. Richard stepped onto the platform behind her. Guild guards in silver-black armor flanked the entrance, visors dark, pulse blades sheathed. They didn't question his presence. His claim of custodial stewardship had been submitted, verified, and marked for arbitration. He had one chance to make his case. The concourse echoed with wealth. Corporate bidders in high-filter masks lined the upper rings, lenses scanning data streams. Hollow drones floated overhead, relaying curated angles to remote buyers. No one looked at her and saw a woman. They saw currency. Virea stood perfectly still at the center of the auction floor. She wore a plain tunic, provided by the station. It dulled the color of her skin, concealed the veins of luminosap beneath the surface. But nothing could dim her presence. She radiated control, despite the fact that she was surrounded, examined, and exposed. Richard couldn't take his eyes off her. He wanted to run to her, to say her name, to take her hand and never let it go again. But he waited. He watched. The auctioneer stepped forward, a thin man with data ports embedded across his scalp. His voice rang out smooth and sterile through the amplifiers. Lot number 7, one live Kaliri root mother, soil-bonded, unspoken class, estimated to possess royal-grade seed memory, certified genetic imprint matched to unauthorized hybrid flora recovered in the outer fringe. Current valuation, open. Numbers flickered into existence above the stage. Initial offers appeared, then rose. 50,000 credits, 75, 90. Richard's hand hovered over the seed case strapped to his chest. He exhaled slowly, then stepped forward. Objection. A brief silence, then murmurs. The auctioneer's eyes flicked to him. Noted. Custodial steward, yes? I invoke Kaliri Charter 3, Section 9, Richard said calmly. Article 12, you have no right to sell her. The auctioneer blinked, his composure faltering. Article 12 is obsolete. It's active under Treaty Provision 14b, Richard replied. Any individual who nurtures a royal seed line from dormancy to viability gains temporary stewardship of both specimen and cultivator. The clause predates the trade charter. Your auction violates interspecies sovereignty. The floor stilled. Above, the bidders hesitated, not out of respect but out of calculation. Delay meant risk. Laws meant lawyers. Lawyers meant time. And time meant someone else might stake the stronger claim. Richard unclasped the case and lifted the hybrid tree into the light. The room reacted. The seedling pulsed with faint bioluminescence, veins of gold and violet dancing through its translucent leaves. It was unmistakably alive and bonded. This is the tree we grew, Richard said, voice low but carrying. Not in a lab, not under corporate orders. We made this, in soil no one believed could support life. We did it without funding, without resources, without permission. You want to measure worth? He turned to her. She isn't owned. She's the reason this exists at all. He stepped closer to the stage. The hybrid plant reached toward Viraya, its stem arched, its leaves unfolded, its roots trembled in their pod. The silence broke when the first delegate rose. She's bonded to it, the woman said from the upper tier. There's no question. She's not just a cultivator, she's the seed line's origin imprint. Another voice followed. You said the tree was stolen, but the tree is her. The auctioneer's face was unreadable, but his tone cracked at the edge. Custodial claim or not, this auction is legally scheduled. Viraya moved. She stepped forward, barefoot, graceful. Her fingers brushed the pod, and the tree responded like a child recognizing its mother. Then, without warning, she extended her other hand. A vine erupted from the base of the seedling. Thin, sharp, fast. It lashed across the floor, stopping inches from the auctioneer's boots. Its thorns dripped sap, viscous and gleaming. He stumbled back, security guards tensed. Another vine sprang forth, graceful, precise, curving up toward the gallery where the bidders sat. It did not strike, it grew, toward the light, toward the breath of air from the station's vents, a demonstration, not of threat, of control. Viraya turned to the crowd. Her voice, when it came, was calm, measured, unshaken. You see rarity, she said. You see market, but what you tried to sell was never yours. She looked to Richard. Because he gave me water, he gave me space, he gave me time to grow. The vines coiled inward, the roots retracted, the tree pulsed once, then stilled. I'm not a specimen, she said. I'm a beginning. Richard stepped onto the platform and offered her his hand. This time she took it. No hesitation, no fear, just trust. The delegates didn't move. The auctioneer said nothing. The guards lowered their weapons. It was over. They walked out through the concourse together, and no one followed. They chose a world without a name, no population registry, no trade designation, just an unspoken dot on an old surveyor's map, an exomoon, orbiting a long-dead gas giant on the edge of the broken belt. The reports had called it sterile. Viraya had called it unclaimed. That was enough. Their vessel, retrofitted, still groaning at the joints, landed on the western plateau just past local dusk. Faint light spilled across the cratered ridges, painting everything in pale rose and bronze. The soil was loose but not lifeless. The scans showed traces of silica, old carbon deposits, and rare hints of atmospheric ghosting, just enough to hold potential. It didn't need to be perfect. It only needed to be possible. Richard stepped out first, boots sinking slightly into the powdery crust. The air here couldn't be breathed, not yet, but it didn't feel hostile. No wind screamed, no radiation surged. The silence wrapped around them like something waiting to be filled. He turned as Viraya emerged behind him, the curved form of the sapling pod in her arms glowing faintly in the dim light. She moved without hesitation now, her steps confident, her back straight. Her red hair, tied back beneath her filtered hood, still shimmered with its copper fire. They said nothing at first. They rarely needed to now. The crater she had chosen was shallow, bordered by fractured basalt ridges. Beneath the loose dust, her instruments had detected moisture veins, fossil humidity trapped beneath layers of mineral frost. The perfect place to begin. Richard unrolled the first soil treatment grid while she knelt, opening the pod's shielding. The hybrid sapling, offspring of memory and rebellion, unfolded its translucent leaves and pulsed in time with her breath. Every time he saw it, he felt a strange reverence, not just for what it was, but for what it had survived to become. She placed it in the dust. He sealed the grid around it. They didn't speak, not until the first droplets of condensed humidity touched the soil. Viraya reached forward, palms flat, pressing into the dirt with both hands, her eyes closed. The sapling responded, its roots pushing downward, hungry, sure. The silence wasn't silence anymore. It was breath. It was ritual. It was life, unfolding slowly. Later, after the microheater had stabilized the perimeter, and the atmospheric mist had risen just enough to cast the faintest scent of earth into the airlocks, they sat together beside the new sprout. No wind, no speech, just gravity and pulse and presence. Richard pulled off his glove and reached for the small canister of nutrient mix at his side. His fingers brushed hers as he passed it. She didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand slightly, letting their palms meet. bare skin to bare skin. He felt the roughness there, the remnants of rope burn, the calluses from grafting bark, and beneath it something warmer, something older, something still growing. "You should name it," he said finally, voice low in the filtered air. She looked at the sapling, then down at the soil, then back to him. "No," she said, "you should." He blinked. "Me?" "You gave me time," she said. "You gave me water." Her voice was soft but anchored. "You gave me back soil." Richard didn't answer right away. He looked at the sapling again, its leaves glowing with the faint trace of both Kaleri and Terran bioluminescence, veins pulsing gently like breath in a sleeping chest. "Let's call it first," he said. She nodded. Simple, honest, rooted. They stayed like that until the second moon rose, casting twin shadows across the ridge. The temperature dropped, but the warmth between them didn't fade. Her shoulder touched his, her head tilted toward him, not resting, not leaning, but near. He didn't move away. He didn't want to. In the days that followed, they expanded the perimeter, dug shallow irrigation lines, installed slow-release mist valves and spore filters. Every hour was labor. Every movement counted. Their fingers stayed stained with dust and sap. Their voices remained low, spare, used only when necessary, and never wasted. And still, something changed between them. It didn't happen in a rush. It didn't need to. One morning, as Richard calibrated the pH monitor near the basin, he felt her hand on his shoulder, steady, warm. When he turned, she didn't speak, just pressed her brow gently to his. Later that night, under a sky painted with stars unclaimed by any map, they kissed, not like the desperate do, not like those clinging to something temporary, but like people who had chosen to stay. The grove came slowly. Second sprouts emerged 2 weeks later, curled like questions and soft as mist. The hybrid root net stretched further than he expected, weaving through the soil in an elegant spiral, an echo of her air-drawn glyphs. Small creatures came, first insects, then spores, then something that glowed faint blue in the dark. Scavenger life drawn by heat and nutrient, drifting into the cradle they'd carved out of ash. Months passed. The station logs listed them as inactive. The guild stopped looking. The bounty expired, and life, quiet, untraded, unpriced, continued to grow. They never spoke of the auction again. They didn't need to. But sometimes, as the grove thickened and the first leaf litter fell in dry, spiraling patterns around their boots, Richard would glance over and catch her watching him, not guarded, not wary, just watching, like someone remembering what trust looked like. On the 7th cycle, when the first tree bore fruit, a pale green blossom that opened like a slow breath, they held it between them in both hands. "It shouldn't be this beautiful," he said. She only smiled, and when he asked, "What now?" she said, "We plant another." On the far side of the grove, past the hill where soil warmed slowest, they planted together again, shoulder to shoulder, hands pressed into the damp loam. The sapling nestled easily into the soil this time, as if the world no longer resisted the idea of hope. When they finished, she stood. He watched her fingers brush the leaves, no longer trembling, no longer afraid of breaking anything. She turned to him, Lumina light dancing in her eyes. "You gave me everything I lost," she said. "No," he replied, stepping close. "We grew it." Then, beneath a sky full of stars no one had named, Varaya reached for him with hands that had once only known silence. And this time, she held on.